So have you ever felt like some ideas, some knowledge, it just works? Like
Yeah.
it slots right in, feels solid, like you're building on something real.
Yeah, definitely. And then other times, information feels, well, kind of floaty, almost like guesswork.
Exactly. Floating, that's a good word. Like there's nothing really holding it up.
Hmm.
Well, there's this really fascinating perspective on that feeling, on how we build knowledge, create order, even how societies might evolve.
And it comes from maybe an unexpected place.
Totally unexpected. The world of, get this, rice breeding.
Rice breeding. Okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah. So we're doing a deep dive today into the thoughts of Xiaoyang Lin.
Hmm.
He spent decades, literally decades, breeding rice.
Wow.
And comparing rice genomes got him thinking, reflecting really on culture, science, progress. It leads to some surprising analogies.
Okay, so that's our source material, these reflections from a rice breeder.
That's the core of it.
And our mission for this deep dive, what are we trying to pull out of this?
Good question. We want to unpack his main ideas. There's this distinction he makes between what he calls experience culture and science culture.
Okay. Experience versus science culture.
And then this really central concept of using a chassis and upgrade model.
Chassis and upgrade, like a car.
Sort of. But he applies it way beyond plants. He's talking technology, social structures, even things like national constitutions.
Okay, that sounds potentially big, applying a breeding concept that widely.
Might sound a bit abstract now, yeah.
Okay.
But the examples he gives are super concrete. And honestly, they could kind of shift how you think about building, well, almost anything.
Whether it's a new rice variety or a new way of approaching a problem.
Exactly.
All right, so where should we start? That distinction you mentioned. Experience culture versus science culture.
Yeah, let's start there. Let's unpack that. So Lynn suggests experience culture. It's basically built on individual experiences, right?
Right.
Observations.
Drawing conclusions from what you've personally seen or gone through, or maybe just a handful of examples.
Right. And the point that the big challenge there is, well, it's uncertainty.
Uncertainty, because even if you have, say, quite a few experiences, it's actually really hard to pull out rules or patterns that you can rely on, things that hold true consistently.
Yeah, especially compared to, proper scientific investigation.
It's like it comes from the real world, engaging directly, but it doesn't always give you that solid foundation you need to predict things reliably or really understand why something happens.
There's just a lot of inherent uncertainty baked in.
So then science culture, as Lynn frames it, it's not like it throws experience away entirely.
No, not a replacement. He sees it more as an evolution from experience.
Okay, and what defines it then?
Its key thing is that it actively questions all that uncertainty you find in experience culture. It digs deeper. It systematically tries to find the real reasons, the underlying truths.
Right, so it takes the raw stuff from experience, the observations, maybe the results you got, but then it puts it through a much more rigorous process.
Yeah, the goal is to figure out what's scientifically verifiable, what holds up. And this is crucial, to discard the stuff that's unreliable. Maybe based on a shaky correlation or just an assumption you never checked.
It's really a deliberate pursuit of certainty, or at least more certain.
Exactly, more certainty.
And one of the main tools science culture uses for this is comparison.
But not just any comparison.
Yeah.
That's key.
No, exactly. Unlike the sort of casual comparisons we might make based on experience, scientific comparison needs strict, consistent conditions, prerequisites.
This is where his rice breeding examples are so clear. He talks about comparing, say, the yield of two different types of rice.
Okay.
For that comparison to tell you anything useful, scientifically speaking, you absolutely have to grow them under identical conditions, totally controlled.
Every single variable needs to be nailed down. The same fertilizer, same amount, applied the same way, same soil, same size plot.
You even have to think about things like making sure they get the same amount of sun or accounting for tiny bits lost during harvest. It's all about isolating the one thing you're actually testing, the rice variety itself.
Meticulous control, that's the name of the game.
And Lynn really stresses that even when you do your absolute best, errors can still happen. They're unavoidable.
Which is why repetition is so fundamental in science, doing the experiment over and over.
Yeah, repeating it multiple times just massively boosts how reliable your results are,
Right.
how much you can actually trust them.
So this whole rigorous process, the controlled comparison, the repetition, all driven by questioning that initial uncertainty, that's what Lynn sees as the core of scientific thinking, the scientific method that defines science culture.
That's how you get from just noticing something anecdotally to having knowledge you can actually rely on, knowledge that can predict things.
Right. So science culture aims for certainty. It builds on experience, but refines it using these tough, rigorous methods.
Makes sense.
But then, Lynn hits a pretty big roadblock.
Ah, okay. It's not all smooth sailing.
Not at all. He points out that even when you have solid scientific results, like a brilliant new rice variety in his work, getting those results applied out in the real world, that faces huge limitations.
So the science can be sound, but it gets stuck, right?
Yeah, it can get blocked from actually being used, from reaching the market. Lynn says it's down to various things. Sometimes it's power dynamics or vested interests.
People protecting their own turf?
Could be. Or sometimes it's just really ingrained, maybe outdated ways people think about things or judge value. Old habits dying hard.
He mentions his own frustration with this, right?
He does. He talks about developing a genuinely superior rice variety based on decades of careful science, but then it fails to get approval.
From who? Like review boards or peers?
Exactly. Maybe because of conflicting business interests, like you said, or because the evaluation criteria themselves haven't kept up with the science. They're using old measures.
And if it doesn't get that approval, that consensus.
Then it can't even be tested properly on a larger scale in the real world, which basically means years of research, all that investment, potentially just wasted.
Ouch. That's rough.
It really highlights that something crucial is missing.
Yeah.
Just doing good science isn't enough for it to actually make a difference.
So what does Lynn say is missing? What's that essential piece?
Consensus?
Consensus. Agreement.
Absolutely. He argues that reaching consensus is totally key if you want scientific progress to actually translate into real-world application and impact.
So before you even start, say, a big breeding project.
You need agreement first, consensus on the goals, what characteristics you're aiming for in the new variety, even the basic methods you're going to use.
Ah, okay. So it's like establishing the ground rules, the shared understanding, before you pour in all the time and resources.
Exactly, like drawing up a really clear contract or agreement beforehand. It prevents a lot of potential fights later on.
Lynn even suggests this idea, reaching consensus as a foundation to build on. It's like a fundamental starting point for civilization itself.
It's a big claim, but you see his logic. Define the terms. Agree on them first.
Right. But, as he also points out, getting that widespread consensus, that's actually incredibly difficult, isn't it?
Whoa, hugely difficult in practice. Once you get beyond really simple things, disagreements are almost inevitable.
Even if you have a signed agreement, people can argue about what it means or stuff comes up that nobody thought of.
Right. And Lynn thinks this massive difficulty in achieving consensus is a major reason why science culture often struggles to really change things in the world. It's a bottleneck.
Okay, so this challenge, this bottleneck.
Yeah.
This is what led him to develop his idea of the chassis.
Exactly. In his own rice work, when he kept hitting resistance to completely new varieties, he shifted strategy. He decided to define the necessary consensus differently.
Oh.
By picking a variety that already had universal agreement, one everyone accepted, maybe it was the most popular one or the tastiest, or the one that sold for the highest price, or maybe one with deep historical significance.
Okay, so find the thing everyone already agrees on.
Yes. And he calls that widely accepted, undisputed variety the consensus.
Got it. And then the chassis part comes in.
Right. He calls the genome the entire genetic blueprint of that consensus variety, the chassis.
Ah, the genome is the chassis, the fundamental blueprint everyone accepts.
Precisely. So the strategy then becomes take that universally accepted genome as your foundation, your chassis, and then just focus on making specific, targeted improvements. Upgrades to particular parts of that genome.
Okay, so you're not trying to sell people on something radically new from the ground up.
No. You're building incrementally, you're improving something they already know and accept as good.
It's an enhancement, not a revolution.
Exactly. And because you started with that chassis, that deep consensus, Lynn found the improved version is way more likely to also gain consensus. People see it as making something good even better.
Which he thinks is the right way, the sustainable way, for progress to actually happen.
Yes. And this is where it gets really interesting, because he started seeing the same pattern chassis and upgrade playing out way beyond rice in how societies develop, how technology advances.
Okay, expand on that. Where else does he see it?
Well, he makes this really striking connection to the founding of the United States.
The U.S. How does that connect to rice breeding?
He sees the whole thinking behind the U.S. system as mirroring his approach. In his view, the U.S. Constitution itself functions as an upgrade.
An upgrade of?
Of the British Magna Carta.
Wow, okay. Comparing the U.S. Constitution to a document from, what, 1215? That's quite a leap.
It is. But he sees the Magna Carta, which evolved over centuries,
Mhm.
as the sort of historical, foundational, social, and legal chassis.
The underlying agreed-upon structure refined over time.
Yes. And then the later amendments to the U.S. Constitution, he argues those are like upgrading specific bits, molecular modules, he calls them, within that constitutional chassis genome.
So the same fundamental mindset. Take the best, most accepted baseline and then improve that.
He believes it's the same underlying logic. And he extends this to human societies generally. Culture, social order, they progress best, he thinks, when they build on a recognized chassis, a core consensus.
And communities or societies struggle if they don't have that.
Right. If they lack both a solid chassis and that spirit of continuous improvement, that drive to find problems and make targeted upgrades.
Fascinating. Does he see it in technology, too?
He does. He points specifically to operating systems like Apple's iOS and macOS.
Yeah.
He sees the explosion of innovation in communication tech that followed their introduction as a prime example. Progress built implicitly on this model. You have a strong foundational design, the OS, as the chassis.
And then developers constantly build on it, upgrade it, add apps.
Exactly. Consistent upgrades building on that solid base.
So this leads him to a pretty broad claim then, doesn't it?
It does. He basically argues that for modern scientific thinking and methods to actually work in the real world, they have to be built on this chassis and upgrade concept.
And he applies this framework everywhere. Applications, social order.
Even what he calls national machines, national systems.
National machines.
No.
Like countries.
Yeah. He finds it kind of a fascinating thought experiment to see the UN Charter as maybe a potential chassis for all of humanity, like a human OS.
A human OS. Wow.
And then individual countries would have their own national OS running on top of that basic layer. He even named his own rice breeding system RiceSo and trademarked it, applying the same logic.
He's really running with this analogy.
Absolutely. And he looks at history through this lens, too. He notes how many former British colonies joined the Commonwealth,
Okay.
suggesting they inherited and adapted a social order, a system that ultimately originated from that Magna Carta chassis.
So inheriting the base software, essentially.
Kind of.
Yeah.
And he points to Japan's constitution after World War II. He says it drew heavily on the U.S. Constitution as its chassis.
Which, in his view, is already a Magna Carta upgrade.
Right. But Japan thoughtfully integrated its own unique cultural elements, like the emperor's role, into that borrowed chassis.
Interesting. What about other places?
Well, from his perspective, he sees systems like Singapore's and Hong Kong's as being based on inherited British software. And he characterizes Taiwan and South Korea's national systems as drawing very heavily, maybe copycat versions, he suggests, from the U.S. model.
So his big picture conclusion, looking at different countries,
is that the operating software of many developed nations seems to be upgrades built upon that long historical lineage tracing back to the Magna Carta chassis.
and he sees a parallel in tech again.
Yeah, he looks at smartphone operating systems, Android, iOS. Despite looking different on the surface, he observes they're functionally becoming more and more similar, converging.
Like they're all kind of upgrading towards the same optimal state,
Almost, yeah. Like how iOS itself has evolved over time, he sees it as a similar process.
which leads into a pretty bold prediction about the future based on this whole framework.
It does. He speculates that with information flowing so fast globally now, and with AI coming on strong, humanity might eventually unify, become a single global village. And the underlying machine or system for that global village, he thinks it will eventually run on a single software,
And that software will be
an upgraded version, he believes, of that same ancient lineage, stemming from Magna Carta, kind of ultimate human OS.
Wow. That's quite the vision. Linking medieval charters to future global operating systems via rice breeding.
It is definitely a powerful and very distinct way of looking at history, society, technology, all seen through the unique lens of a breeder's deep experience with genetics, variation, and making targeted improvements.
What an incredible journey we've taken through this material. Really, starting with that basic uncertainty and experience,
Moving to the rigor of science, trying to find certainty.
then hitting that real-world wall, the challenge of getting everyone on the same page, achieving consensus.
Yeah, that crucial bottleneck.
And finally landing on this really compelling idea that stable, practical progress often comes from building on an accepted foundation, a chassis, through deliberate strategic upgrades.
And we saw how Lin applies that single idea across such different fields. Rice genetics, yeah, but also U.S. history, national systems, the phone in your pocket.
It really makes you rethink what progress even looks like, doesn't it? And how lasting systems actually get built.
It absolutely does.
Which kind of leaves us with a final thought, something for you, the listener, to maybe mull over.
Based on this whole concept, the chassis and the upgrade, what are the foundational assumptions, the sort of chassis that you recognize yourself operating from?
Yeah, think about it maybe in how you learn things, or how you approach your job, or even just how you make sense of the world day to day.
What are those underlying agreements, those accepted structures or realities that form your base, your starting point?
And then maybe consider this. How might adopting that mindset of targeted upgrades change things for you?
Focusing on improving specific parts of what's already there, that existing foundation.
Instead of feeling like you always have to tear everything down and start completely from scratch,
Right. How might that change how you tackle problems or build something new, whether that's a skill you're learning, a project you're working on, maybe even a relationship?
start looking around.
Oh.
See if you can spot this pattern playing out, where having that consensus on a foundation allows for real, incremental, impactful improvement.
It's a lens that, well, it seems to show up in some pretty surprising places once you start looking for it.